At 06:58 hours on October 25, 1944, Commander Ernest Evans stood on the bridge of USS Johnston, a Fletcher-class destroyer displacing 2,700 tons and armed with 5.5-inch guns, watching through binoculars as 4 Japanese battleships emerged from the morning mist off Samar Island. Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, displacing 72,000 tons and mounting 9 18.1-inch guns that could fire projectiles weighing 3,200 pounds to a range of 26 miles, followed by Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna, each displacing over 30,000 tons and carrying 8 14-inch or 16-inch main battery guns that could destroy Johnston with a single hit from a range where Johnston's guns couldn't even reach them. Behind these 4 Leviathans came 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers, a surface action group representing more combined firepower than any fleet the U.S. Navy had faced since the Battle of Midway, and they were steaming at 20 knots directly toward the Leyte Gulf invasion beaches where 130,000 American soldiers were landing with virtually no naval gunfire support available to defend them, because every battleship, every heavy cruiser, and every fleet carrier that might have stopped this Japanese force was 300 miles north chasing a decoy fleet in what would later be recognized as one of the most successful diversionary operations in naval history. Evans knew exactly what he was looking at because the Combat Information Center had been tracking the Japanese formation for 20 minutes, reporting course, speed, and composition, while Johnston's crew absorbed the mathematical reality of what engagement would mean. They were part of Taffy 3, a task unit consisting of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts designed for anti-submarine warfare and close air support, not surface combat against the most powerful battleship task force Japan could assemble, and they were the only thing standing between Admiral Kurita's center force and an invasion fleet that was completely defenseless against battleship gunfire. The escort carriers behind Johnston, Fanshawe Bay, St. Lo, White Plains, Kalinin Bay, Kitkin Bay, and Gambier Bay, carried aircraft designed for ground support and anti-submarine patrol, not for sinking battleships. And even if their pilots could organize strikes against armored warships, the carriers themselves would need to survive long enough to launch aircraft, which meant someone had to delay the Japanese force long enough for the carriers to turn into the wind, bring aircraft to flight decks, and get them airborne before 18-inch shells turned the thin-skinned escort carriers into burning wreckage. Evans made his decision in the 3 seconds it took his executive officer to say, "Sir, recommend we generate smoke and withdraw with the formation." A perfectly reasonable suggestion based on the tactical reality that destroyers didn't charge battleships any more than infantrymen charged tank columns, that survival required accepting. You couldn't win every fight. That preservation of force was a legitimate strategic consideration when facing overwhelming superiority. And Evans rejected every word of it with an order that contradicted every principle of naval tactics, every instinct of self-preservation, and every calculation that suggested Johnston should live through the next hour. He keyed the 1MC connecting him to every station on the ship and spoke into it with the matter-of-fact tone of a man ordering routine course change rather than probable suicide. "All hands to general quarters. This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can." Then he ordered flank speed, turned Johnston toward the Japanese formation rather than away from it, and began a solitary charge directly at 4 battleships supported by a task force that outgunned his destroyer by a ratio of approximately 200 to 1 in terms of shell weight that could be delivered on target per minute, because Evans understood something that would take naval historians decades to fully appreciate, that mathematical superiority only mattered if you survived long enough to apply it, that psychological impact could be as important as kinetic effect, and that sometimes the most effective tactic wasn't the one that made sense according to doctrine, but the one that made no sense to an enemy who'd planned for rational opposition. The Japanese had spent 3 days approaching Leyte Gulf through narrow straits where American submarines and aircraft had savaged their formation, losing 2 battleships, a heavy cruiser, and thousands of men to torpedo and bomb attacks that had convinced Admiral Kurita his force was being hunted by the full weight of American naval aviation. And now, when he finally emerged into open water, expecting to destroy defenseless transports and cargo ships, he saw a destroyer charging directly at his battleships as if that destroyer represented the vanguard of a major surface action group, rather than a solitary ship making what appeared to be either a suicidal last stand or the covering force for something much larger that Kurita couldn't yet see. Johnston opened fire at 0700 hours from a range of 18,000 yards, too far for effective accuracy but close enough to make the Japanese formation notice they were being engaged, and Evans began a weaving course at 35 knots that made Johnston a difficult target for the Japanese battleship gunners who were accustomed to engaging other battleships that moved in predictable lines at predictable speeds, not destroyers making radical course changes every 45 seconds while closing range and firing continuously, despite taking hits from shells that would have sunk a destroyer with direct impact, but were missing by margins measured in yards rather than miles, because the Japanese fire control systems were calculating for targets moving in straight lines, not for targets that changed course and speed constantly while charging into point-blank range where destroyer torpedoes became the most dangerous weapon any battleship could face. The engagement that began at 700 on October 25, 1944, would become the last time in naval history that destroyers charged battleships in surface combat, and it would save an entire invasion fleet not through firepower or armor, but through audacity so complete that the enemy couldn't process what was happening until it was too late to stop it. Ernest Evans grew up in Pawnee, Oklahoma, as the son of a Cherokee mother and a white father, which meant he grew up understanding what it meant to exist between worlds that didn't always acknowledge each other's legitimacy. The white world that ran the schools and owned the businesses and made the laws, and the Cherokee world that remembered treaties broken and land stolen and promised that people who survived by adapting were sometimes the ones who preserved what mattered when direct resistance failed. He learned early that being underestimated was tactical advantage if you were smart enough to recognize that other people's assumptions about what you could or couldn't accomplish created opportunities for those willing to prove assumptions wrong. And he carried that understanding through his appointment to the Naval Academy in 1927, where he was one of the few Native American midshipmen in an institution that still reflected the racial assumptions of an era that believed command belonged to certain kinds of people, and that others, regardless of capability, should accept supporting roles in hierarchies that had been established by men who looked nothing like Ernest Evans. He graduated from Annapolis in 1931, ranking in the middle of his class academically, but noted in his fitness reports for aggressive tactical instinct and willingness to accept calculated risk, which were the kind of evaluations that could be read as either praise or warning, depending on whether the officer reading them valued initiative over caution. And Evans spent the next 13 years working his way through the peacetime Navy's destroyer force, learning that destroyers existed in the uncomfortable tactical space between vessels too small to survive against major combatants and too valuable to waste on missions that didn't require their speed and maneuverability. The doctrine that governed destroyer operations in the 1930s emphasized the torpedo as the destroyer's primary weapon. High-speed approach under cover of darkness or weather, launch torpedoes at capital ships from ranges where the destroyer's small size and speed made it difficult to target, withdraw before enemy guns could achieve effective fire control. But Evans recognized that this doctrine assumed enemies who followed predictable defensive patterns, who valued preservation of their capital ships enough to turn away from torpedo attacks, who would trade tactical position for safety rather than press attacks against vessels that threatened them. By the time Johnston was commissioned in October 1943 with Evans as her commanding officer, he'd developed a tactical philosophy that his officers found either inspiring or disturbing, depending on their own tolerance for risk. And that philosophy could be summarized in the words he'd spoken at Johnston's commissioning ceremony when he told the assembled crew that this is going to be a fighting ship and that he intended to go in harm's way whenever opportunity presented itself. which was not the kind of speech most destroyer captains gave, because most destroyer captains understood that survival required knowing when to fight and when to preserve your vessel for fights where you actually had advantage. But Evans had watched the early years of the Pacific War unfold with attention to which tactical approaches succeeded and which failed, and he'd noticed that Japanese forces, despite their reputation for aggressive tactics, often hesitated when faced with unexpected threats, that their command structure struggled with situations that didn't match their operational plans, and that the psychological impact of being attacked could be as operationally significant as the physical damage inflicted if that attack came from directions or in forms the enemy hadn't prepared for. Johnston's first major action came during the Marianas Campaign in June 1944. Where Evans distinguished himself by pushing his destroyer closer to shore than doctrine recommended to provide gunfire support for landing forces, taking hits from Japanese coastal batteries in exchange for suppressing enemy positions that were cutting down Marines on the beaches. And when his operations officer suggested that destroyers weren't designed to trade hits with shore batteries that had the advantage of stable firing platforms and pre-registered positions, Evans had responded with the observation that Marines on beaches weren't designed to assault fortified positions without naval gunfire support either, and someone had to accept risk or the entire landing would fail. He earned a Navy Cross for that action, along with a reputation among the destroyer force as a captain who interpreted mission accomplishment as more important than preservation of his ship, which made him exactly the kind of officer who'd either die young or become legendary depending on whether his aggressive instincts proved brilliantly effective or catastrophically misguided. The Battle of Leyte Gulf began on October 23, 1944, as the largest naval engagement in history. Hundreds of ships, thousands of aircraft, battles fought across thousands of square miles of Philippine waters as the Japanese Navy attempted one final coordinated operation to destroy the American invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf by approaching from multiple directions simultaneously, forcing the Americans to divide their forces to counter threats from the north, south, and west, while the main Japanese striking force, Admiral Kurita's center force, penetrated through San Bernardino Strait to hit the invasion beaches from an unexpected direction. The American battle plan anticipated this approach and positioned Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet, with 6 fleet carriers, 8 battleships, and supporting cruisers and destroyers, to intercept Kurita's force as it emerged from the strait, which should have resulted in the decisive surface action where American firepower superiority would destroy the Japanese battle line before it could threaten the landing beaches. But the Japanese had learned from 3 years of defeats that American commanders responded predictably to threats they understood, which meant the way to achieve tactical surprise was to present threats American doctrine said to prioritize even if those threats were diversions rather than main efforts. And on the evening of October 24th, Japanese carriers, empty of most of their aircraft, stripped of their offensive capability, serving as nothing more than floating decks to attract American attention, appeared north of the invasion area, exactly where American doctrine said carriers represented the highest priority target. Halsey faced a decision between maintaining position to intercept Kurita's battleships emerging from San Bernardino Strait or chasing the Japanese carriers that represented what doctrine identified as the primary threat, and he made the decision that aggressive commanders throughout history have made when offered the choice between defensive positioning and offensive opportunity. He took his entire fleet north to sink the carriers, leaving San Bernardino Strait unguarded except for radio messages to subordinate commands that assumed someone was watching the strait and would respond if Kurita's force emerged. No one was watching the strait because everyone assumed someone else was watching it, which was how, at 0630 hours on October 25th, Kurita's center force, 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers, emerged from San Bernardino Strait into Philippine waters and turned south toward Leyte Gulf, where 130,000 American soldiers were landing from transports and cargo ships that carried no armor, mounted no significant guns, and depended entirely on naval protection that wasn't there, because that protection was 300 miles north, chasing empty carriers. The only American naval forces between Kurita's battleships and the invasion beaches were 3 escort carrier task units, Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and Taffy 3, With a total of 16 escort carriers designed for anti-submarine warfare and close air support, 9 destroyers and destroyer escorts designed for convoy protection, and absolutely no preparation for surface combat against the most powerful battleship task force the Japanese Navy could assemble. Evans was eating breakfast in Johnston's wardroom when the watch officer called down at 06:45 to report that Taffy 3's radar had picked up a surface contact bearing north-northwest at 30,000 yards, and Evans reached the bridge within 90 seconds to find his operations officer reviewing the contact report with growing concern, because the contact wasn't a single ship, but a formation, and the radar signatures suggested large combatants moving at 20 knots on a course that would intercept Taffy 3's position within 30 minutes. Evans ordered Johnston to general quarters, the alarm sending crew members running to battle stations throughout the ship, and picked up his binoculars to scan the northern horizon where morning mist was beginning to burn off under tropical sun. And at 06:58 hours, he saw what the radar had been tracking, which was the moment his executive officer made the perfectly reasonable suggestion about generating smoke and withdrawing with the formation, and Evans made the decision that would define everything that came afterward. Johnston's charge toward the Japanese battleships began with a course change that turned the destroyer from defensive formation position to attack, heading in a maneuver so abrupt that the other ships in Taffy 3 initially thought it was a navigational error rather than deliberate tactical decision, because destroyers simply didn't charge battleships the way Johnston was charging. Bow pointed directly at Yamato's massive superstructure, engines building to flank speed, 5-inch guns beginning to fire as soon as the range closed enough to make hitting something a mathematical possibility rather than pure chance. Evans had calculated the geometry of what came next with the kind of cold tactical clarity that only emerges when you've already accepted that survival is improbable, and the only remaining question is how much damage you inflict before the inevitable conclusion, and his calculation told him that Johnston needed to close to torpedo range, approximately 10,000 yards for effective launch against moving targets, which meant covering 8 nautical miles while under fire from guns that could destroy his ship with a single hit, and the only way to survive that transit was to make Johnston so difficult to target that Japanese gunners would miss often enough for the destroyer to reach launch position before catastrophic damage stopped the advance. The first Japanese salvos landed at 07:02 hours when Johnston was still 17,000 yards from Yamato, massive waterspouts rising 200 feet in the air as 3,200-pound shells impacted the ocean 150 yards short of Johnston's position, the kind of near misses that would have been direct hits if Evans had maintained steady course and speed, but were missing, because Johnston was weaving at 35 knots in a pattern that changed every 45 seconds, making radical turns that threw off the Japanese fire control solutions that were attempting to predict where Johnston would be when the shells arrived, rather than where Johnston was when the guns fired. Evans understood that battleship gunnery relied on plotting target movement to calculate lead angles, that fire control computers needed several salvos to establish accurate firing solutions, and that if Johnston never maintained a consistent course long enough for those solutions to stabilize, the probability of being hit dropped from certain to possible, which was the narrow margin between immediate destruction and surviving long enough to matter. By 07:08 hours, Johnston had closed to 15,000 yards and was taking hits, not from main battery guns which were still missing by yards rather than feet, but from secondary batteries and destroyer escorts in the Japanese formation that were engaging with smaller caliber weapons that didn't require the same precision fire control, and these hits were causing damage throughout Johnston's superstructure, shrapnel tearing through radar equipment, communications gear destroyed, casualties mounting in exposed positions, but not causing the catastrophic damage that would stop the ship's advance, because destroyers were built to absorb damage from weapons smaller than battleship main batteries, and as long as the engineering spaces remained intact and the torpedo mounts remained functional, Johnston could still accomplish the mission Evans had defined, which wasn't to sink Yamato, but to make Yamato turn away from the escort carriers long enough for those carriers to launch aircraft. At 07:15 hours, Johnston reached 10,000 yards, point-blank range in naval gunnery terms, close enough that Johnston's 5-inch guns were hitting Yamato's superstructure with enough frequency to cause visible damage to radar arrays and fire control directors, nothing that would threaten the battleship's combat capability, but enough to make Japanese officers on Yamato's bridge recognize they were being engaged by a destroyer that should have been fleeing, but was instead charging and shooting and closing range, as if that destroyer represented a threat rather than a target. Evans ordered torpedo launch, and Johnston's 10 Mark 15 torpedoes, each carrying 825 pounds of Torpex explosive and capable of breaking a battleship's keel if they hit below the waterline, rippled out of their tubes in a spread pattern that covered the zone where Yamato would be if she maintained course and the zone where Yamato would be if she turned to avoid, which meant Kurita faced a decision between accepting possible torpedo hits or turning his formation away from the threats represented by both the torpedoes and the destroyer that had launched them. Kurita turned away, ordering his entire formation to execute a turn to starboard that opened the range from Taffy 3's escort carriers by 5 miles and consumed 12 minutes of time that the carriers used to turn into the wind and begin launching aircraft. And in those 12 minutes, the tactical situation transformed from Japanese battleships about to destroy defenseless carriers to Japanese battleships under air attack while trying to close with carriers that were launching more aircraft. Because Taffy 3's pilots, flying Grumman Wildcats and Avengers designed for ground support and anti-submarine patrol rather than attacking armored warships, were making runs on the Japanese formation with whatever ordnance they had available, which in many cases was nothing more than machine gun ammunition and the willingness to make strafing runs on battleship bridges to distract fire control personnel who were trying to direct guns at carriers. Johnston's torpedoes reached Yamato at 07:18 hours, and one of them, exactly 1 out of the 10 launched, struck the battleship's hull below the waterline on the starboard bow, detonating with enough force to flood 2 compartments and reduce Yamato's maximum speed from 27 knots to 23 knots, which was not enough damage to threaten the battleship's survival, but was enough to reduce her tactical mobility at exactly the moment when that mobility mattered most, because Kurita was attempting to coordinate a high-speed pursuit of the escort carriers, and suddenly his flagship couldn't maintain formation speed. The tactical impact of that single torpedo hit exceeded its kinetic impact because it forced Kurita to make another decision, either slow the entire formation to match Yamato's reduced speed or allow the formation to separate with faster ships pursuing while Yamato fell behind. And Kurita chose to maintain formation cohesion, which meant the entire Japanese advance slowed at the precise moment when speed was the only thing that could transform numerical superiority into tactical success before American air attacks became overwhelming. But Johnston's charge had cost her severely. By 07:20 hours, the destroyer had taken over 40 hits from various caliber weapons and was trailing smoke from fires in the forward superstructure, had lost all radar capability, had casualties in every exposed position, and was barely making 28 knots due to damage to the engineering plant that hadn't stopped the ship but had reduced her maximum speed enough to make continued high-speed maneuvering impossible. Evans assessed the damage and made another tactical calculation, which was that Johnston had accomplished the mission of delaying the Japanese advance long enough for air attacks to begin, but was now too damaged to continue offensive operations against battleships, which meant the destroyer's remaining value was in drawing fire away from the escort carriers by continuing to engage the Japanese formation and making herself enough of a threat that some portion of Japanese gunnery had to be devoted to destroying her rather than targeting the carriers. He ordered Johnston to continue engaging the Japanese formation from whatever range the damaged destroyer could maintain, which meant falling back while firing continuously at targets of opportunity. Japanese heavy cruisers that were attempting to close with the carriers, destroyers that were moving to screen the battleships, any target that Johnston's guns could reach. And this sustained harassment had effects beyond the physical damage inflicted, because Japanese commanders were trying to execute a coordinated attack plan that required concentration of force against the escort carriers. And Johnston's continued resistance meant that concentration was disrupted by a destroyer that should have been sunk an hour ago, but was still fighting, and still dangerous enough that ignoring her meant accepting continued hits from 5-inch guns that could damage fire control systems, communications equipment, and the exposed personnel who operated them. The other destroyers in Taffy 3, USS Howell and USS Heermann, had followed Johnston's example and were making their own torpedo runs against the Japanese formation, which meant Kurita's battleships were facing not a single suicidal destroyer, but a coordinated attack by 3 destroyers that were launching torpedoes from different angles while under air attack from carrier-based aircraft that were hitting the Japanese formation with bombs, torpedoes, and in cases where pilots had expended all ordnance, were making dummy runs to force Japanese ships to maneuver defensively and disrupt their fire control solutions. The cumulative effect of these attacks, none of which individually threatened to sink battleships, but all of which collectively disrupted Japanese tactical cohesion and forced defensive maneuvering that consumed time and created confusion, was that Kurita's pursuit of the escort carriers became disorganized, with different ships engaging different targets at different ranges while trying to avoid torpedoes and aircraft and maintaining formation integrity, and the longer this chaos continued, the more time Taffy 3's carriers had to launch aircraft, and the more American aircraft appeared overhead to complicate Japanese attempts to execute their attack plan. By 30 hours, Johnston was dead in the water. The accumulated damage from over 2 hours of continuous combat had finally destroyed enough of the engineering plant that the destroyer could no longer maintain steerage, which meant Evans had to give the order he'd been avoiding since the battle began, which was to abandon ship before Japanese gunners shifted their attention back to the crippled destroyer and finished what they'd started 2 hours earlier. The crew began going over the side into water that was warm enough to survive in, but also filled with oil from damaged ships and debris from vessels that had already sunk, and Evans remained on the bridge, watching through binoculars as Kurita's formation finally reached firing position on the escort carriers and began landing hits on Gambier Bay, which was taking enough damage that her sinking was inevitable, and Evans understood that Johnston's charge hadn't saved all the carriers but had delayed the Japanese advance long enough that only 1 carrier would be lost instead of all 6, which meant the invasion fleet at Lady Gulf would survive because the air support that protected those transports and cargo ships would continue operating from the 5 carriers that Johnston's sacrifice had saved. Johnston sank at 09:45 hours, going down bow first as Japanese destroyers finally closed range and delivered the coup de grace with gunfire and torpedoes that turned the crippled destroyer into wreckage, settling toward the ocean floor 18,000 feet below the surface, taking with her 186 men, including Commander Ernest Evans, who'd chosen to remain aboard rather than abandon ship. And as Johnston disappeared beneath the waves, the surviving crew members floating in the water reported seeing Japanese destroyer crews saluting the sinking American vessel in recognition of courage that transcended national allegiance, and acknowledged that sometimes the most effective tactic in naval warfare wasn't the one that made mathematical sense, but the one that made psychological sense, the one that convinced an enemy with overwhelming superiority that pressing that superiority would cost more than it was worth. Admiral Kurita stood on Yamato's bridge at 09:50 hours, watching the American destroyer disappear beneath the waves and trying to understand what had happened during the past 3 hours, because the tactical situation made no sense according to any assessment his staff could provide. His center force had emerged from San Bernardino Strait with overwhelming superiority, had encountered what reconnaissance identified as a lightly defended escort carrier group, and should have destroyed that group within 90 minutes before proceeding to the invasion beaches where defenseless transports waited to be sunk. Instead, his formation had spent 3 hours under continuous attack from destroyers that charged his battleships as if those destroyers represented capital ships rather than expendable escorts, from aircraft that made attack runs even when they'd expended all ordnance, from torpedoes that forced defensive maneuvering that disrupted his formation's cohesion, and the result was that his force had sunk 1 escort carrier damaged several others, and lost track of how many American ships were actually in the area because the chaos of the engagement made it impossible to distinguish between vessels he'd already engaged and new contacts that kept appearing on radar screens. His operations officer was reporting that the formation had expended over 60% of its main battery ammunition, that several heavy cruisers had sustained damage requiring repair before sustained combat operations could continue, and that radio intercepts suggested American reinforcements were approaching from multiple directions, which might have been accurate intelligence or might have been American deception, because Kurita had learned during 3 days of fighting that American forces excelled at creating the impression of strength even when their actual combat power was limited. The fundamental question Kurita faced was whether the resistance he'd encountered represented a desperate last stand by isolated forces or the screening elements of a much larger American formation that was maneuvering into position to trap his ships in restricted waters where their numerical superiority would be neutralized by tactical positioning. And this question mattered because if he pressed forward and encountered the full American battle line that Halsey commanded, his entire force would be destroyed before it could retreat through San Bernardino Strait. At 10:12 hours, Kurita made the decision that would be debated by naval historians for decades afterward. He ordered his formation to break off the attack and withdraw toward San Bernardino Strait, choosing preservation of his force over continuation of the mission to destroy the invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf. And this decision represented the culmination of psychological effects that had accumulated throughout the engagement, starting with Johnston's charge at 0700 hours. Kurita had watched one destroyer attack his battleships with such apparent confidence that his first assumption had been that the destroyer represented advanced screening for major American surface forces, and even after that assumption proved false, and he recognized he was facing only escort carriers and their destroyer screens, the sustained intensity of American resistance had convinced him that continuing the attack would result in losses his force couldn't sustain, that American reinforcements were certainly approaching, and that the tactically sound decision was withdrawal rather than pressing an attack that might succeed but would leave his force too damaged to survive the inevitable American counterattack. The decision was professionally defensible according to every principle of force preservation and risk management. And it was also exactly wrong because there were no American battleships approaching, no massive reinforcements steaming to intercept, nothing between Kurita's force and the Leyte Gulf beaches, except the 5 surviving escort carriers of Taffy 3 that were too damaged and too depleted to stop him if he'd pressed forward. But Kurita didn't know this because Johnston's charge and the subsequent attacks by other destroyers and aircraft had created the psychological impression of an American force that was much larger and much more capable than it actually was, and in war perception often matters more than reality, because commanders make decisions based on what they believe is true rather than what is objectively true, and Johnston had made Kurita believe that pressing forward meant facing threats he couldn't see but had to assume existed. The Battle of Leyte Gulf ended with the Japanese Navy's last coordinated attempt to challenge American control of Philippine waters, broken not by the overwhelming force that should have stopped them, but by the cumulative psychological effect of resistance that shouldn't have been possible. And at the center of that resistance was Johnston's charge at 700 hours that had set the tone for everything that followed by demonstrating that American forces would fight rather than flee even when fighting made no tactical sense. The invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf, 130,000 soldiers, thousands of tons of equipment and supplies, hundreds of transport and cargo ships, survived because Kurita turned away, and Kurita turned away because ships like Johnston had convinced him that victory would cost more than his force could sustain. The immediate aftermath of the battle saw 1,130 American sailors dead or missing from the ships that had been sunk during the engagement: Johnston, Hoel, Gambier Bay, and the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, with thousands more wounded from vessels that had survived but sustained heavy damage, and these casualties represented losses that were statistically insignificant compared to the 130,000 soldiers whose survival depended on the naval forces that protected them. but were individually devastating to the families and communities that had sent those sailors to war with the expectation that naval superiority meant relative safety compared to ground combat. Evans's widow received notification of his death in November 1944, along with posthumous award of the Medal of Honor, making Evans the first Native American in the U.S. Navy to receive the nation's highest military decoration, though the citation focused on conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, without fully capturing the tactical audacity of charging battleships in a destroyer or the psychological impact that charge had on enemy decision-making. The tactical lessons from Johnston's charge spread through the Navy's destroyer force with analysis that tried to extract replicable principles from an action that had succeeded through circumstances that couldn't be reliably reproduced. You couldn't train destroyer captains to charge battleships because the tactic only worked when enemies weren't prepared for it, when psychological factors outweighed material superiority, when the cumulative effect of sustained resistance created decision-making paralysis in enemy commanders who had every reason to press their advantage, but chose caution over aggression. The official after-action reports acknowledged that Taffy 3's defense had been extraordinary, and that destroyer actions had been instrumental in forcing Japanese withdrawal. But the reports struggled to articulate why those actions had been effective, beyond noting that aggressive tactics created tactical confusion in enemy formation, which was accurate but incomplete because it missed the psychological dimension where Evans's willingness to die attacking battleships had made Kurita doubt his own assessment of American strength. By December 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf had been analyzed by naval intelligence, studied by tactical schools, and incorporated into case studies about surface combat in the Pacific War. And the consensus that emerged was that the battle represented an anomaly rather than a template. Circumstances where inferior forces defeated superior ones through courage and determination that couldn't be assumed to work in other situations because enemies would adapt, because material superiority usually prevailed given time to apply it, and because tactics that depended on enemy mistakes or enemy caution were inherently unreliable. This institutional assessment wasn't wrong about the unreliability of expecting enemy mistakes, but it missed the deeper lesson that Johnston had demonstrated, which was that psychological effects could be as operationally significant as kinetic effects when those psychological effects influenced command decisions at critical moments, and that sometimes the most effective weapon wasn't the one that could sink the most ships, but the one that could make enemy commanders doubt their own superiority enough to choose caution when aggression would have succeeded. The survivors of Johnston, 141 men who'd gone into the water when the ship sank and been rescued by American forces over the following days, carried stories about Evans that became part of destroyer force culture and contributed to the institutional identity of ships and crews that understood their role as accepting disproportionate risk to protect larger vessels and accomplish missions that couldn't be achieved through firepower alone. These survivors reported that Evans had remained calm throughout the engagement, that his orders had been clear and purposeful even when the tactical situation was deteriorating, and that his decision to charge the Japanese battleships had been made with full understanding of the probable outcome, but also with conviction that the mission, protecting the escort carriers, required accepting personal sacrifice in exchange for buying time that those carriers needed to survive. The statistical impact was calculable in ways that individual courage never fully captures. Johnston's charge delayed Japanese advance by approximately 30 minutes through direct combat effects and another 45 minutes through the psychological effects that influenced Kurita's subsequent decisions. And those 75 minutes represented the difference between American escort carriers being destroyed before they could launch effective airstrikes and those carriers surviving long enough to get aircraft airborne that contributed to Japanese decision to withdraw. The 130,000 American soldiers at Leyte Gulf, whose survival depended on naval protection, never knew how close they'd come to facing battleship bombardment that would have turned the invasion beaches into killing zones. And most of them never learned about the destroyer that had charged 4 battleships to buy the time that saved them. The war in the Pacific ended August 15, 1945, and by that time, the Battle of Leyte Gulf had been recognized as the largest naval engagement in history. Over 200 sailors engaged across 4 major actions spanning 3 days and thousands of square miles of Philippine waters. But the specific story of Johnston's charge against Yamato and the subsequent impact on Kurita's decision-making remained somewhat obscure in the broader narrative of American naval victories that emphasized carrier aviation and submarine warfare over surface actions that resembled the kind of gun and torpedo combat that most naval planners believed had been made obsolete by air power. The institutional Navy preferred stories about technological superiority and systematic application of force over stories about individual ships making decisions that violated tactical doctrine and succeeding through psychological effects that couldn't be reliably predicted or controlled. And so Johnston's action was documented in official histories, but not featured as a primary case study in how the Pacific War was won. Ernest Evans received the Medal of Honor posthumously, with a citation that his widow accepted in a ceremony that acknowledged his courage and sacrifice, while carefully avoiding any suggestion that his tactics should be emulated by other destroyer captains. Because the Navy understood that you couldn't build doctrine around actions that depended on enemy commanders making specific psychological responses to unexpected threats, and that celebrating suicidal charges might encourage junior officers to confuse courage with tactical judgment in situations where preservation of force would serve strategic objectives better than dramatic sacrifice. The citation praised Evans for extraordinary heroism and inspiring devotion to duty, without mentioning that his charge against battleships had violated every principle of destroyer tactics that the Navy taught at its schools and expected its commanders to follow, which meant the institutional message was that Evans's action had been heroic, but not necessarily correct according to professional military standards. The survivors of Johnston remained in contact through the years following the war, forming associations that preserved the ship's history and Evans's memory in ways that emphasized the human dimension of the battle. The specific decisions made under extreme pressure, the sailors who'd continued fighting even when survival seemed impossible, the commanding officer who'd chosen to attack when withdrawal would have been professionally defensible. And these survivor accounts gradually influenced how the Battle of Leyte Gulf was understood by historians, who recognized that official reports often sanitized the chaos and uncertainty that characterized actual combat, and that the psychological dimensions of warfare were harder to document, but sometimes more operationally significant than the kinetic effects that dominated. After-action analyses. By the 1960s, books and articles about Leyte Gulf were beginning to feature Johnston's charge more prominently, framing it not as an anomaly, but as a demonstration of how inferior forces could prevail against superior ones when tactical audacity created decision-making paralysis in enemy commanders who had every material advantage but lost confidence in their ability to exploit it. Admiral Kurita's post-war account of the battle, published in a Japanese naval journal in 1952, provided insight into how Johnston's charge had influenced his thinking during those critical hours on October 25th, and his explanation revealed the psychological mechanisms that Evans had exploited, whether consciously or intuitively. Kurita described the American destroyer attacks as creating impression of fanatical determination that suggested the escort carrier group represented advanced screening for much larger forces, and he acknowledged that his decision to withdraw had been influenced by assessment that American forces were willing to accept any level of casualties to prevent Japanese advance, which implied that pressing forward would encounter resistance far exceeding what his damaged formation could overcome. This assessment was factually wrong because there were no major American forces approaching, and the resistance Kurita had faced was the maximum effort of forces that were already fully committed. But Kurita's belief in that assessment had been operationally decisive because commanders make decisions based on perceived reality rather than objective reality, and Johnston's charge had shaped Kurita's perception in ways that mathematical calculations of firepower ratios couldn't predict. Modern naval doctrine incorporated lessons from Leyte Gulf, but struggled to codify principles that applied to Johnston's specific action because the circumstances that made the charge effective, enemy uncertainty about American strength, psychological impact of unexpected aggression, cumulative effect of sustained resistance creating decision paralysis, were inherently situational and couldn't be assumed to exist in future engagements. The institutional approach that emerged was to acknowledge that aggressive tactics by inferior forces can create tactical opportunities through psychological effects on enemy decision-making, while emphasizing that such tactics remained high-risk approaches that required specific conditions to succeed, and that systematic application of superior force remained the preferred method for achieving naval objectives. This careful framing allowed the Navy to honor Johnston's sacrifice while discouraging destroyer captains from charging battleships as if such charges represented legitimate tactical doctrine rather than desperate improvisation that had succeeded partly through skill and partly through circumstances that couldn't be reliably reproduced. The U.S. Navy named 3 ships after Ernest Evans in the decades following his death: a destroyer escort commissioned in 1955, a guided missile frigate commissioned in 1974, and an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer commissioned in 2012. And each commissioning ceremony included references to the original Johnston's charge against overwhelming odds as inspiration for crews who would serve aboard vessels bearing Evans's name, though the specific tactical lessons from that charge remained ambiguous because modern naval warfare had evolved in directions that made World War II surface actions seem quaint in an era of guided missiles, nuclear propulsion, and satellite targeting systems where engagements occurred at ranges measured in hundreds of miles rather than yards. But the psychological principles that Evans had exploited remained relevant regardless of technological changes, because those principles reflected fundamental aspects of human decision-making under uncertainty. That confidence could be shaken by unexpected resistance. That material superiority didn't guarantee willingness to accept casualties necessary to apply it, and that sometimes the most effective way to defeat superior force was to make enemy commanders doubt whether pressing their advantage was worth the cost. The wreckage of Johnston was discovered in October 2019 by deep-sea explorers using remotely operated vehicles to survey the ocean floor 18,000 feet below the surface off Samar Island, and the images that emerged from that discovery showed a destroyer that had been torn apart by the kind of damage that battleship guns inflicted on vessels never designed to withstand such punishment. Hull sections scattered across hundreds of yards of seafloor, turrets separated from their mounts, superstructure collapsed into wreckage that barely resembled the ship that had charged Yamato at 0700 hours on October 25, 1944. The discovery brought renewed attention to Johnston's story and prompted reflection on how technological capabilities that made such deep-sea exploration possible also revealed the physical evidence of tactical decisions made 75 years earlier, when commanders had to calculate odds of survival against imperatives of mission accomplishment, and sometimes chose mission over survival, because that was what the situation required, regardless of what doctrine recommended. The debate about whether Evans's decision to charge the Japanese battleships represented brilliant tactics or reckless gamble that happened to succeed continued among naval historians who understood that historical analysis benefits from hindsight that wasn't available to commanders making real-time decisions under combat conditions, and that judging tactical choices required acknowledging the difference between what should have worked according to doctrine and what actually worked according to results. The mathematical reality was that destroyers charging battleships should lose, that inferior forces engaging superior ones should be destroyed, that survival requires accepting some fights can't be won, and preservation of force serves strategic objectives better than heroic sacrifice. But Johnston's charge had violated all these mathematical realities and succeeded anyway, because warfare involves psychological dimensions that mathematics can't fully capture, and because sometimes the most effective tactic is the one enemies have dismissed as impossible, because no rational commander would attempt it. Ernest Evans died at age 36, having commanded Johnston for exactly 13 months from commissioning to sinking. And in that 13 months, he demonstrated tactical principles that the institutional Navy struggled to incorporate into doctrine, because those principles depended on judgment, audacity, and willingness to accept personal risk in ways that couldn't be reduced to procedures or taught through systematic instruction. The lesson his charge offered wasn't that destroyers should attack battleships or that inferior forces should engage superior ones, but rather that effectiveness in combat sometimes requires violating rules that exist to prevent failure, that psychological effects can be as operationally significant as kinetic effects, and that the difference between reckless stupidity and brilliant innovation often becomes clear only after results are known. The 135th American soldiers who landed at Leyte Gulf and survived to fight across the Philippines toward Japan never knew how close they'd come to facing battleship bombardment that would have turned invasion beaches into catastrophes, and the vast majority never learned about the destroyer captain of Cherokee descent, who'd charged 4 battleships to buy time that saved them. But in the specific sense that matters most, the sense where tactical decisions made in combat have consequences measured in lives saved or lost, Evans's charge represented the difference between an invasion that succeeded and one that might have failed catastrophically, and that difference justified every principle of military doctrine his actions violated, because doctrine exists to serve mission accomplishment rather than the reverse. And sometimes accomplishing the mission requires commanders willing to recognize when following the rules means accepting defeat that breaking the rules might prevent. Thanks for watching the story of USS Johnston's suicidal charge that saved an entire invasion fleet. If this moved you, hit that like button. It helps us reach people who appreciate stories about courage that transcends tactical doctrine. What strikes me about Commander Evans's decision is how often effectiveness requires doing what experts say is impossible. Destroyers don't charge battleships, except when they do, and the psychological impact matters more than the firepower ratio. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from, and have you ever succeeded by doing what everyone said couldn't work? Subscribe for more untold naval stories about the thin line between reckless stupidity and brilliant innovation. New videos weekly.